All right, we are continuing our series on rerouting. Next week on Father's Day is our last one, and today is on suffering. The premise of the series is that there are things in life that we imagine we would never have to go through, especially as Christians, and surely we get the inside track with God, and in a lot of ways that's true. But still, there are times where in order to do all the work that he wants to do of transformation in our lives, he takes us on some very painful back roads. And if you're just with us for the first time, I would recommend, if you are interested in this, to go back on our website and you can find the messages and listen to them again. In your handout, if you're here today, then you can see the different back roads we've taken and how God defines joy in different ways. And today, we're looking at the back road of suffering. I wrote this poem, maybe a year ago or so. It's called The Sculptor. This massive, weighty thing, a giant granite rock, cut out of mountainside, it sits as one great block. Transported far away from ice and winter snow, cold is left behind, now in sculptor's studio. Shattering hammer blows, the hard granite pounded, giant pieces flying, sharp slivers compounded. Rocks, pebbles pulverized, dust and smoke abounded. What a waste of granite! I am so confounded. I hate the sledgehammer, this mighty thundering. I can't bear this pressure. Why all this suffering? Loud banging and clanging, what a cacophony. How I miss the mountain, its peaceful symphony. In one hand the chisel, the other a hammer, sharpened edges cutting, painful shrieks I clamor. Knife-like wounds incisive, penetrating, stabbing. Why won't the sculptor stop this vile, endless jabbing? I am just a shadow of my former self, discarded, cast off scraps, frivolous, on the shelf. My tower of strength gone, now a life of weakness. This bulk of power gone, what I see is useless. All I can see of me is what's been chiseled off. Scraps, shreds, shards of rock, much dust to make me cough. The sculptor smiled. I see me. A mirror had arrived. Inanimate rock lives. This dead rock, now alive. How can a heart of stone become a heart of flesh? Does it take suffering and pain in which to thresh? To come alive with hope and find the source of joy? Much of self pulverized. Sin had to be destroyed. What I once thought his tools, the chisels and hammers, were unrequited love, loneliness, and clamors, mundane duties of life, failure, futility, desire, hunger, longing, bringing humility. The heart of the sculptor, the core of life's substance. In his redemptive aims, we find our abundance. The real meaning of life shown from heaven above, found deep within his heart, flows Calvary's deep love. Well, our topic is suffering, and it's a very tough message to talk about. And one of the reasons why is that suffering is very, very personal. If you've been through times of suffering, the last thing you want to hear is a theological treatise about suffering. It's very difficult. And the second reason why it's a difficult message to put together is that on the scale of suffering, Mindy and I have not been through the level of suffering that a number of you have been through, a number of our folks, or we have some folks that watch by Facebook Live. Some of the things I know that you all are going through are far more difficult than what I do. So with that, bear with me as we go through this message. Third reason why talking about suffering is so difficult is that there is so much that could be said about it. And I'm trying to do this in about 30 minutes, so bear with me on that. The route to joy that we're being rerouted is the time of suffering, and there's some signposts along the way that God will lead us to. But the type of joy that he's trying to lead, our definition number 8 here, is hope. Not hope in the sense of, I hope something good is going to happen, but biblical hope is a certainty of what's coming. It's coming. It will be here. And one day, I will be there. Hope. Anticipation may be a better word than even hope. More than that, Romans 5:3 says, more than that, we rejoice in our sufferings. Another one of those great paradoxes of the New Testament. We rejoice in our sufferings? You've got to be kidding. These verses sound a lot like the ones we looked at last week in James when we talked about trials. We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. Hope. And hope does not disappoint us because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. Hope. And so in your handout, there's a little schematic that looks a lot like last week's schematic, except instead of trials, we have suffering. And the word hope is added into this verse as it relates to suffering. Now, before I talk about suffering, I'm going to talk about something else, and that is the ache that is in everybody's soul. There's a lot of Christian teaching and books and on the radio and TV you hear, and one of the messages that seems to always come, many times comes through, is that if there's an ache in your soul, there are things you can do about it to quench the ache and make it go away. And unfortunately, as Christians, it gets our hopes up around the wrong things. And then when our ache doesn't go away like we think it's supposed to, we wonder what's wrong with us or what's wrong with God. The Bible does not promise that ache is going to go away in this world. Listen to what Romans 8:23 says. Paul says, not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly. Now, before this, he's talked about the whole world groans. That's just part of life here on planet Earth. We are not home yet, and this life is fallen. It doesn't work like we think it should. He says we groan inwardly. Now, notice what he says about who groans here. He says those who have the first fruits of the Spirit. He's not talking about non-Christians. And he's not talking about carnal Christians. He's talking about people who are serious about walking with God. That we are going to groan inwardly. And sometimes you'll see that groan in an interchange with your spouse that doesn't go the way you kind of hoped it would. Or something at work, or when you're by yourself. That ache in the heart, sometimes it feels like a pain down in your soul. Now, what he says is we groan inwardly as we wait eagerly. Waiting eagerly is the same as what he describes as hope. We wait eagerly. In other words, even the ache that is in our hearts is productive. It's purposeful. It continues to lift our eyes to what's coming someday when we will be in heaven. The ache in the heart is not a matter of spiritual immaturity. It's a matter of spiritual reality about the world that we live in. So in your handout, because we were built to enjoy what is not fully available until heaven, there will always be an ache in our soul. It's okay to ache. It's okay to groan. We're supposed to groan. It leads us through a doorway of hope. Now, when we go through times of suffering, then we'll get into the message. Suffering exposes our hearts like nothing else does. And I want to mention 3 things here that you will find if you listen to your heart and pay attention to what's going on. And these are in your handouts. 3 counterfeits that we typically will try to get off of that back road and back on the road we want to be. And there are 3 things you will find bubbling up in you or driving you. Number 1, Find a way to manage life in order to alleviate the ache. In other words, rather than go to God and pour out your soul to him and to see that the top solution starts with my relationship with God, we'll go to work. We're going to get busy. We're going to fill our day with good things to do. It's not the good things to do are bad. It's just that we are taking the wrong road. We are trying to get back on the road that we can manage. And this becomes our principal purpose without us even knowing we're doing it. Manage life to do away with the ache. Number two, if you can't manage life to deal with the ache, find a way to feel good about yourself. That's our backup plan. When I'm trying to manage life to do away with the ache and I can't manage it well enough and keep the ache and pain away, then I'm going to find some way to feel good about myself. Now, feeling good about yourself is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's something very wrong with it when it becomes a counterfeit to dealing with our ache. And this becomes our principal priority. And we do this mostly without even being aware that this is what's driving us. And number three, do whatever it takes to achieve relief. If I can't manage my life to do away with the ache, and I can't find some way to feel good about myself in such a way to deal with the ache, then our backup plan C is find some way to find relief, whether that's a good way to do that or a not good way to do that. And these things become just sort of how we operate. These are the drivers that just sort of move us through life. Why is suffering important? One of the reasons why suffering is important is that it exposes these very three things for us to see and to give attention to. If we don't see these things exposed and give attention to, then these things drive all kinds of messes in our lives. These three things are primarily what drives addiction. These three things are what oftentimes slowly sucks the life out of a marriage. These three things are components of what brings depression or anxiety or anger. And it's hard for us to see these things. We probably won't see them without suffering. All right, so we're going to look at the life of Job, chapter 1. We're going to just kind of do a summary of the life of Job. Job is an interesting man. The book starts off in chapter 1, verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz, not Oz, but Uz. His name was Job. And that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. There are very few people in the Bible that get this kind of rave reviews like Job. He was also wealthy, prosperous. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him, 10 kids. His possessions also were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. Oh, he had a wife, he had 7 sons, 3 daughters, and he was a rancher and farmer by trade. And he had lots of property that he was working on and lots of livestock that he was working on. Very many servants. And that man was the greatest of all the men of the East. Now, this is not just some Joe Schmo who's going to go through, some loser guy who's going to go through suffering. This is one of those people that gets the highest reviews in the Bible regarding him. Now, along the way, the story tells us that Satan goes to God, and he's pretty upset about something. The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." And Satan thinks about this and he says, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you put not a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. The message is simple. Oh, yeah, you want to brag about Job and the kind of person he is? Hey, you've been a Disneyland dad to Job. Who wouldn't praise you and worship you? But take away all his goods, and let's see what kind of love and worship he has for you then. And God responds in just a moment, which we'll look at. Before we look at this, I want to say something about depression, because this often is related to suffering. And there are a lot of things that could be said about depression. If you're on medication for depression, my personal opinion is that's a good thing. There's no scriptural law that says that that's a bad thing. I also don't think that that's an unspiritual thing. But beneath the physiological aspects of depression, there are two drivers that I want to highlight that drive us in depression. Number one, the loss of what we deem as life. All of our hearts define, without us even knowing it, what it is we need in order to be fulfilled or to have life, to be full. We all define that, and we have different definitions of how our heart defines that. Now, when we lose that, what we define as life, depression is going to start. Secondly, we gave up finding a way to get what we think we need. We don't think about the first definition, that maybe our first definition is faulty. We just work and scramble to try to get back what we lost. And when we find out that over and over again we can't do it, then depression sets in. Let's pick up the story with Job again. So the Lord responds to Satan's challenge. Very well then, everything Job has is in your hands. But on the man himself, do not lay a finger. Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Now the story, we're going to jump to verse 13. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So one day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the older brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing, donkeys were grazing nearby. So there's the scene is the 10 children. I'm assuming that they're mostly in that young 20s, maybe late teenagers or late 20s or early 30s. The 10 of them are having a great time together, having a dinner together. And the messenger comes back with these words to Job. The oxen were plowing, so there's activity out in the farm fields. The servants are plowing the field. And the donkeys were grazing nearby. Verse 14. And the Sabaeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. So the messenger comes to Job and says, while your 10 kids were having a dinner, the Sabaeans came, and they took all the oxen that were out in the fields and ran them off. And they took all of your donkeys that were grazing, and they ran them off. And when your servants tried to keep this from happening, they cut everyone down with the sword. Next verse. While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, the fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. Now, we don't know exactly what that fire was. All we do know is that all of the flocks of sheep, I think there were 7,000, are gone within moments. And the shepherds, the servants that were hired to be a part of this, they were gone as well. Next verse. While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. All of this happens in one day. The 3 messengers come within minutes of each other. Job, who had been a very wealthy man with lots of holdings, lots of farmland, lots of livestock, it's all gone. Gone. I think, well, did he have any money in the bank? Well, we're not told about that. What do you do if you don't have any money in the bank and you've lost everything that your business? Would he scrape enough money to buy a male sheep and a female sheep and start all over again? A male camel and a female camel, could he afford that? Would he be out in the fields hoeing and trying to plow the ground on his own and doing the seeding? Did he have enough money even to buy seed for the next crop? All of these things come boom, boom, boom. But it's not the worst. Verse 18. While he was still speaking, yet another messenger, the fourth one, said, your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the older brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the four corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead. And I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. 7 sons, 3 daughters, gone. Gone. This man's sunlight turned to midnight within moments. Now, when things like this happen, the thing that we all clamor for is the question, why? Everyone's plunged into a nightmare and wants an explanation. The story of Job, the explanation, the only explanation we're giving, seems to us very frivolous. And we want to look at that frivolous explanation as if that's the only explanation. Well, that's the only explanation given. It's my opinion there are probably dozens and dozens of explanations that if we could understand are part and parcel of this whole story. But we just want the explanation. Why? What's the one thing? Why is this? Well, why didn't God give a clear explanation to Job? Would it have helped him? If you've ever been through suffering and you've had somebody try to explain to you why something is going on, you already know what that's like. You want to tell them to get the hell out of the room. You haven't been through what we've been through. Sometimes explanations seem to make things worse. And this is what you'll find in Job 3 through 37. His 4 friends try to explain the suffering that he's been through, and they go through 12 different explanations repeatedly in patterns through those chapters, and every one of those discourages him even more. I don't think explanations really help. Well, we sang about trusting God a few minutes ago, some great songs. And what this story tells us is that we have to have an open hand about the events of our life. Trusting God does not mean that I'm going to get the events as I want them. We have no guarantee of that. What do we trust God for then? We trust God for the story of our life, that no matter what events we go through, a redemptive God is going to take us by the hand, and he's going to walk us around that route, rerouting, and he's going to get us someday, finally, to a place of eternal joy. That's what we're trusting God for. Now, his initial response, verse 20. At this, Job got up, tore his robe. Tearing a robe in that culture is a sign of calamity. Shaved his head, and that's an image of, I've lost the glory. Grieving his 7 sons and 3 daughters. Then he fell to the ground in worship, and this is a picture of surrender. I don't know what else to do except, God, come back to you in surrender. Here I am. Take me as I am. Along this back road and the signposts you have for me. Satan comes back to him, back to God, after doing all of his dirty work. And Satan's not done yet. Chapter 2, verse 4. Satan tries to get in God's face, and he says, skin for skin. A man will give all he has for his own life. But stretch out your hand, strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. The Lord said to Satan, very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes of mourning. Now Satan took just about everything important to Job except one thing besides his health. Of the things he could have taken and didn't, he left Mrs. Job. We're sort of left to speculate about why. I suspect from what we know of Mrs. Job that Satan realized he had an ally in the enemy's home. And he was right. She said to Job while he is in mourning, are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die. He replied, you are talking like a foolish woman. So we accept good from God and not trouble. In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. Now, this is an amazing first response to suffering. But if you've been through suffering, you may have had a first response like this, but as time goes on, weeks and a couple months, then the life of suffering and the life of grief is messy. And from Job 3 through 37, you get pictures of what messy is like. Job is confused. He's perplexed. He's angry. There are times where he's resentful, times where he's bitter. There are times where he shakes his fist in God's face and said, you're not being just. Now, these are not, as I understand it, these are not unspiritual responses. This is the wrestling of the human heart with God. The picture of this is Jacob back in Genesis. You see another picture of this with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. This is what happens. Now, his friends, so-called friends, well-meaning, try to encourage him, and they are the voices of discouragement. They make his life more miserable. Most of the time when people go through times of suffering, they just need you to be present and listen. You're not going to be making any theological statements. Please do not do that. You'll discourage them, just like Job was. Now, how does suffering lead to hope? And that's what I'd like just to finish with here. Suffering removes the illusion that what I need for my life to be full, I can make happen. That's gone. That illusion is gone. And when that illusion is gone, an empty heart says, well, how can I be full? And that's where God says, look up. Look up. I'm taking you on a road. I want you to walk with me on that road. And I'm going to show you my face in ways you would never see my face without suffering. I want to lead you to a place of joy. I'm going to give you some tastes of it along the way, but the banquet's still to come. Set your hope there in me and where I'm leading you. Paul describes in 2 Corinthians 4:16 through 18, I love these three verses because he puts a different perspective on suffering. He contrasts our suffering with the joys that we're going to have someday in heaven. And listen to how he deals with this contrast. He says, so we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles, meaning sufferings, do not compare with the glories yet to come. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, transient. What is unseen is eternal. Eternal joy. Suffering lifts us to a place where all we have is hope. And that hope becomes a joy in little pieces of it along the way as God determines to give. But the tastes of the banquet, the tastes of the food, we get little tastes of it here. But we anticipate, we look forward to the joy of anticipation of what's coming ahead. When I think about heaven, the things that I think about this week, I think about that ache in my soul that I cannot deal with, I cannot quench for very long, is finally going to be gone. And I think about those annoying things that still bother me about myself, where I am critical and inwardly caustic, and I compare myself to other people. And I'm still so self-centered. All that stuff is finally going to be gone. I won't have to deal with any of that CRAPOLA again. The connections that I can't quite seem to close and make will be gone. And every morning will be Christmas. I'm also looking forward to seeing the face of Jesus, who through the course of my life has taken me on some back roads like he's taken you on some back roads. And has walked me through some of the things we've talked about. Shattered dreams, unmet longings, brokenness, the loss of control, a fallen world, trials, suffering. And next week we'll look at our last one in this series, failure. It's brought me to a place of joy. Vance Havner was a pastor for many years, and he became a chaplain of the U.S. Senate years ago. Very godly man, and when his wife died, he had many people that came to him and gave their condolences and told him they were praying for him. And one of the things that he heard repeatedly from his friends was, "I'm so sorry for your loss." And one fellow said, I can't imagine what you've lost. And Vance Havner says, "Oh, I haven't lost her. I know exactly where she is." And then he quote this poem: "Death can hide, but not divide. I know where she is on the other side. She with Christ and Christ with me, united still are Christ and we." And that is our hope. Let's pray together. Maybe you're here this morning and you've wondered, maybe you've been a person like many in our culture who blame God for suffering. I could never trust God because he allows suffering and evil to go on. And maybe today you find yourself suddenly with nothing to say. That a redemptive God, someone bigger than you ever imagined, desires to take you by the hand, and if need be, to take you on some painful back roads. But his intent is to do the work that needs to be done in your heart and to bring you ultimately to a place that he describes as joy. Maybe you say, I've been a fool and proud. And today I can see all he asks you to do is to say, I am a sinner by nature, a rebel. And thank you that Jesus Christ came in my place because he loved even me and gave his life for me to make all of this possible. If you've never prayed that, just pray silently. Lord, I know I'm a sinner. Thank you for the cross of your Son, Jesus Christ, his blood spilled for me, forgiveness and washed clean and a new start. Come into my life. Sit on the throne of my life. Lead me ahead.